Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us for our time here in these videos reflecting upon the events of Holy Week. I know that we're all eagerly looking forward to celebrating Resurrection Sunday together tomorrow, but we don't want to get there too quickly because today we're going to be focusing on Saturday. And I'm really excited to be joined by these two guests today. We have Ashley Chestnut here with us, part of our staff, one of our ministers to young adults here at Brook Hills, and then Keith Stanley, who's our pastor of City Ministries. And as we begin to look at what many call Holy Saturday, there's the reality that we don't know a ton of, we're not even given a lot of what's happened on Saturday. In these videos, we've been focusing on kind of what Jesus has been doing throughout the week. And Jesus is obviously not up to much on this day. He's dead and he's buried. And in fact, one of the only passages we have about Saturday is in Matthew 27 in verse 62. We just read that the next day, so on Saturday, which followed the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that while this deceiver was still alive, he said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give orders that the tomb be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come, steal him, and tell the people he has been raised from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. You have guards of soldiers," Pilate told them, "go and make it secure as you know how." And so they went and secured the tomb, setting a seal on the stone and placing the guards. So we know that guards were placed, and we don't know a ton else. Yeah. But obviously one thing we do know is what the day was, what Saturday was, the importance and significance of that day. So Ashley, why don't you kick us off by kind of talking about that a little bit?
Sure. And if you're not familiar about the Sabbath day, Sabbath actually starts on Friday at sundown and goes until Saturday at sundown. And so it would be the Sabbath day. We know that they were limited in what they could do, even in how far they could walk. They could only really walk about 3/4 of a mile. And so all of this means that they were probably, because of exhaustion, probably sleeping. I would imagine there's some of that they did on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. But the Sabbath is also a time of reflection, because you can't just keep yourself busy. You can't plan a funeral. You can't go and prepare the body. And so I imagine the Sabbath day is when the events of the past couple of days caught up with them, mentally, emotionally. I think about when someone dies, those initial emotions of denial and anger are really part of that first stage of grief. And so you probably had some of that in all of them, different disciples with different emotions, but anger probably at themselves, anger at Judas, who would have committed suicide either on Friday or Saturday. They may not even know of his suicide and his death yet. But anger at him, anger at themselves for not being able to stay up with Jesus in the garden, for not stopping what had happened, for betraying Jesus, for running away. And I would imagine even Jesus's teachings in John 14-16 from the Last Supper, I imagine those teachings would be replaying as well, maybe even some dots connecting. Because you do have time to think, and those were your last memories of Jesus and with Jesus. So probably a lot of time for reflection was happening, and the emotions that accompanied that reflection.
Yeah, it's, you mentioning their exhaustion even there to begin with. You think about starting on Thursday night, right? Like they're in the garden, Jesus is praying with their disciples to do it, they're falling asleep. Like they're obviously tired, and then the arrest happens. And the trial is happening on Friday, but it's that night, right? Yeah. Like all this is happening throughout the night, and they're there and they're away. And then, the actual crucifixion. And then, as you said, Sabbath starts at sundown Friday night. So that's why the burial is kind of rushed. Like, I can't remember, one of the Gospels even highlights that they had to, he was buried quickly because the Sabbath was approaching. And so, it's, so, I mean, here on this day of rest, they have to have been, I don't know how restful it was for them, but needing
needing
some of
bodily.
that. Yeah, absolutely, physically at least. But I would say, as you highlight, there's a lot of other things going on in them too. What do you think some of those others might have been, Keith?
Well, first, coming back to what she said, I can't imagine the trauma that they had just experienced. I've had friends who have had a family member, a close friend, murdered. But this, it's different when you witness the murder, and it was so cruel. It was over such a long period of time. It had to just kind of affect them emotionally in a way that they were probably in shock. They were just exhausted emotionally, probably confused. I think there was probably just a sense of shame that many of them were having, just as they reflected back over the last few days. I mean, on the very day that Jesus was arrested, they were arguing about who was going to be the greatest. I mean, can you imagine? Like,
Yeah.
you're thinking about that was important to us, right? And of course, they had fallen asleep during the prayer time that night at the garden. Jesus had come to them 3 times on the most important night when he needed their support the most, and they're falling asleep. They can't stay awake, and I'm sure that brought some shame. But think about Peter. Jesus had rebuked him that night when the mob showed up, and he cut off the ear of the high priest's servant and said, "Hey, this is not about a revolution." And I think all the disciples probably thought it was, that this was the moment. The Messianic kingdom is going to come. But then he had denied Jesus, right? And he was supposed to be the leader of the rock, right? And I think about the shame when they all ran away. That night they'd all said, "Hey, we're going to die for you. We're willing to go to prison." And just how much shame they must have felt. They're watching everything happen, and they're not intervening. So I think there was just a lot of emotion. You mentioned anger. I think there's this anger probably was there that once again the Romans have won, right? This oppressive power has just they've shown their force again. They've beat down the Messianic kingdom that we wanted to see happen, and they've crucified our rabbi, our master, the Son of God. And so, I think there was a lot of just shame that night.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I think also of how we deal with shame. We all face shame all the time. Sometimes there are unrealistic expectations we have of God in a moment, or of ourselves. We know that we're going to fail. We have failed, and it may be we haven't met our own expectation, or maybe a sin or whatever. And I think our tendency is to want to run hide. Just like Adam and Eve, we want to run from God, at that moment. So I think they were feeling a lot of that shame overwhelming them at that moment.
Yeah.
And even with that, I just think about some of the questions that they were probably asking. I mean, like, why would God allow this?
Yes.
And why didn't Jesus save himself? And did we just waste 3 years of our life? Like, what was it all for? And not knowing what was ahead, but I'm sure those questions, those why questions, that's just human nature.
Yeah.
When something tragic happens. So I would imagine that's also part of the processing as well.
Yeah, I always think it must be, it's hard for us to put ourselves in their shoes. And one of the reasons is just because we know what comes next.
Yes.
Like we're pumped. We know what comes.
Yeah.
But you mentioned was the 3 years wait. Yeah, for 3 years they've been with Jesus. I mean, all day, every day, like hearing him, like literally hearing his voice, like the literal, a spoken voice of God every day, constantly. And then here on, I've always thought about just how silent it must have felt. Like we'll hear the phrase, the silence of God sometime. And I just think how Saturday must have really felt like the silence of God. Like we literally aren't hearing Jesus anymore. And those are we even hearing from God? Like what does this mean? What's coming? And I think that's something that Saturday has to say to us, because whereas it might be hard for us to get in their shoes, we know what it is to be exhausted. We know what it is to question and wonder and not see exactly God's hand at work and where it's going, or to feel shame or just confusion. Like you said, to just wonder.
Yeah, I think there was probably great confusion. What amazes me is when you read the text, like on Resurrection Day, they're surprised. like the women are surprised, and then they remember, oh yeah, Jesus said something about the third day, rising again. And the disciples don't even believe it. So, they're not like anticipating this resurrection. There's this confusion. I think they really were confused on some of the teachings of Jesus about his kingdom. And so, there was just this trying to figure this out. I wish we knew that they had turned to Isaiah and began to read more about the suffering servant of God, but I don't think they did. I think they were just in total confusion at that moment.
I don't think they had a scroll in the upper room
Yeah,
that they were just able to turn to. And that is something like, also in the midst of this, they're not at a place that's comfortable to them. They're not from Jerusalem. They had come to Jerusalem for the Passover. The upper room that they celebrated the Passover meal at, that was probably where they were for the duration of the week, because they would have celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread right after the Passover for the next week. And so, and even when we see references for the next couple of days, it's talking about how the disciples are in a room together with the door locked because they're scared of the Jewish religious leaders. Fear. So they probably are together, but they're not in a place that's even comfortable. It's not at home.
Yeah.
And so even that, I'm sure, made all of this even harder.
Yeah.
When I look at that, though, I see God's grace. I was thinking today that Jesus could have been crucified on Wednesday or Tuesday, but in God's sovereign grace, he had this all planned out so that Jesus would be crucified right before the Sabbath. And so they were gonna step into a moment of rhythm that they were familiar with, where they were going to worship and they were going to pray and they would look in His Word. And it just kind of reminds me at those times of confusion in my life, or things haven't worked out the way I thought God was going to work, or where I feel the sense of shame, where I feel the sense of anger, how important that rhythm of the Sabbath is, that rhythm of coming together and worship. Just that healthy rhythm I think we all need, that God gives us by His grace to call us to worship, to get in the Word, to be with other believers, to be encouraged in fellowship. And I think that's a rhythm that we can learn from the story, that even in the time of silence and darkness, when we feel overwhelmed, confused, that is so important, just to make that rhythm of the Sabbath part of our life, but also to go to the Lord and worship.
Yeah.
Right.
In the Christian tradition, right, like this Sabbath shifted from Saturday to Sunday because of what happens on Resurrection Day on the Sunday. And often it gets associated with Good Friday, but we will use the phrase of Sunday's coming. Yeah. But I know I've begun reflecting more on that phrase on Saturday because of all these things we're talking about. When we're tired, when we're questioning, when we're confused, when we're scared, when we're wondering, when, they had to have felt all that in that quiet, in that silence, and yet, right, they could still cling to the promise. They didn't know how it was going to happen. Like, God had made promises. Maybe they didn't even remember what Jesus had said, but he had said those things to him so they could click. And so I think it's just final encouragement for all of us is just on this Holy Saturday as we sit and reflect on whatever we might be experiencing in our lives right now, right? Sunday's coming.
Yeah.
God's promises, His fulfillment, it's coming, and we do get to gather together tomorrow and worship and celebrate that. So we hope that you're making plans to join us to do that tomorrow, or if you're not a part of Brook Hills, that you're planning to be with another church tomorrow celebrating together, and that as part of that celebration, not only with God's people, that you'll also join us for just our last video as we reflect upon the events of Resurrection Sunday. We'll see you then.